Okay, thanks everyone. I'm glad you're able to join us today for this conversation. Um, we will be introducing our panelists in just a moment and jumping into the conversation. But before that, I'd like our colleague and leader of the Office of Innovation and Commercialization at UCSD, Paul Robin, to say a few words before we start. After we find Paul.
Hello, can people hear me now?
We can, yes. Hi, Paul.
Oh, yeah, I don't know. I can't see myself and I can't hear myself, but anyways. Okay, yeah, so first of all, welcome to everybody to the webinar. Just to say a few words on this, I mean, a very important part of our mission here at the Office of Innovation to bring people together around these really important issues that affect us all in our community. We believe that discussion of these issues helps us at the office to evolve to better serve the constituency that we serve, but we also feel that these discussions help everybody to understand these issues better, and ultimately will allow us to be more productive members of our own society and community. So having said that, I'd like to welcome you all to this. Thank you all for taking some part of your day to be with us. I hope that you find the discussion interesting, and I hope you learn something new and maybe hear a perspective on this that you haven't heard before. Also like to thank, of course, Greg for putting all of this together and for moderating the session, and Rachel for helping to put it together. And of course, last but definitely not least, thank you to all the panelists who are giving us the benefit of their perspectives. Very much appreciated. So with that, I'll just hand it back to you, Greg.
Thanks, Paul. Part of the role that the Office of Innovation Commercialization is we're a convener. We act as an honest, this neutral broker across campus, but also with the community. And we're able to weave together all intentions and support mechanisms that look at the innovation and commercialization schemes and support entrepreneurship at UCSD. And so these conversations are of top of mind for us. The last webinar we did on the future of education helped us elicit some insights from not only the participants, but from our speakers on how we might take this opportunity, particularly in this COVID reality, and as we move forward into these new ways of learning, how we may be able to use that. And this future of work follows on that. It's a natural segue because we're all working in very, very different ways, as evidenced by just what we're doing right at this exact moment, talking over Zoom, where we might otherwise have been in a room together, having these conversations. And so we want to explore not only exactly how we're working, but how the very nature of work is changing the culture of human interaction and social interaction, but also the work itself in terms of the types of jobs that are being created and how those jobs are evolving and changing. And so we have a wonderful group of panelists today representing everything from a very macro perspective to very much the user-centered perspective of this topic. I'm going to start by asking Roberto Alvarez to make a couple of comments. Roberto is a colleague of mine. He was kind enough to invite me in as a senior fellow to the Global Federation of Competitiveness Councils. And he'll tell you a little bit of what the council is responsible for, but also kind of what he's seeing at this more macro level in terms of this topic of the future of work. And then we'll slowly kind of work our way down the funnel to the ground, and then have a lively discussion in terms about how our local interactions affect things at a much higher level. And we're going to end this conversation by talking about what are some proactive things that we specifically can do to change what we're doing at UCSD to better prepare the students, both from a functional perspective, but also an experiential perspective for this more dynamic and ambiguous workforce. But also, what are some of the new novel and emergent best practices that are coming into being that we can be exploring in terms of how each of us will be affected by these events and how we will be working in the future. So that said, Roberto, I welcome you to make a few opening comments.
Thank you, Greg. It's great to be here with you. Great to see you and all the colleagues. So the GFCC is Global Federation of Competitiveness Councils. It's a multi-stakeholder global organization. We have members that are universities, including the University of California, San Diego. We're happy to have Chancellor Khosla, Pradeep Khosla as the, let's say, the founding chairman of our University Research Leadership Forum. And so we have universities, corporations, government bodies, like mostly innovation agencies, and private sector councils, industry chambers, federations, and the like. Combining our membership and fellows like Greg, we have a footprint in 30 different countries today. So what I'll share with you, it's my perspective coming from that global setting. It's really a diverse setting in terms of geographies, in terms of the stakeholders that we engage with. And so this conversation is about the future of work. And in a few days, actually in 2 days, Netflix will release the 3rd season of one of my favorite TV shows, Dark. And people there, there's a tagline that says, hey, it's not about where you are, it's about when you are. And I would approach this through the opposite, for the reverse perspective. It's not just about on when, but it's also about where you are. So the future already is here in some way, but it's not evenly distributed. I think that, as a lot of us have been talking, right? So 3 things that I want to share with you, a bit about the future of work. I think that we don't have a final answer for sure, but we have different clues on what's coming up and what's next. The second, it's really about how we're approaching our different stakeholders across the globe. We're approaching this through the training, education, and development perspective. What are the initiatives that are being piloted, tried, implemented to prepare future workers, right, or people in the workforce? And finally, some of the emerging issues that we're seeing, right? So on the future of work, I think there are 3 things that are really driving this future reality. The first is technology growth. We're seeing that digitalization, or whatever technology related that is changing the way in which we work, we organize work, organizations are set up, so on and so forth. The second one is longevity. And the third one is something that was caught, it was seriously hit by COVID, but it's the emergence of the experience economy. So 3 things that I understand are really reshaping work in some way. The first, as I said, technology and things like how we use, it's not just about developing new technologies, but how we use and integrate technology in settings that are not individual, but that include other team members, either they are human or non-human team members. I think it's a kind of a very important topic. And when we think about that, I think there's a growing consensus that lots of things about the future of work, they will be on the one hand related to technology, but on the other hand, really related to how we do things. So I think soft skills are gaining importance, and we're seeing this across the globe, right? So I would say there's a new blend that really combines 3 things: an increased importance the increased importance of soft skills, localized needs of technology, and that are industry specific, that are company specific, that are sector specific, especially hard, I would say hard tech skills. And finally, a widespread need for the use of the ability, the skills to use new tools, new tech tools, right? I think it's important to say, if we have a look at the US, and I'll finish this talking about some global issues that we're seeing, like 1/3 of the workers in the US, of the workforce, are related to STEAM, science, technology, engineering, and math. There was a report published recently by 3AC and the Council on Competitiveness in the US that you know, Greg, that highlights that. And in an indirect way, 2/3 of the works today are let's say of jobs in the US today are supported by STEAM, science, technology, engineering, and math. At the same time, we have lots of jobs that they're open, not just in the US, but across the globe, like a place where I come from, Brazil. We have more than 70,000 open jobs in Brazil that are IT related, and we don't have the people to provide the skills that are needed. For sure, there's a lot of talk that's debatable in some settings, and we should analyze that carefully, right? So in terms of skills, or the skills part of the future of work, I really see it as things that are cross-sector. I would say basic digital skills and soft skills are gaining momentum in this future of work setting that we're seeing. The second thing, once again, it's related to things that are industry specific. And there are certain industries, and I mentioned hospitality. This is seriously being changed by the COVID reality, but everything health related, even before COVID, will gain a broader share in the economy perspective. So I think that will affect the, let's say, the landscape for work and skills. Second thing, how are we seeing skills development going forward, and how are different nations approaching that? I think there's some interesting national experiences from Canada to Germany, from Singapore. Canada has created a skills center that the whole logic there is not just to provide the skills that will be needed in the future, but to learn about that. So they're running a series of experiments on skills development and a national level working with different geographies. I think it's an interesting way of approaching this, prototyping things, skills development frameworks. Singapore is implementing a different type of solution, really providing tools for citizens to assess their own skills and to navigate this complex and unfolding reality, right? But this is surely hitting everybody. We did a research, like a survey in the GFCC. I think more than 60% of participants mentioned skills gap, and most of participants highlighted Nordic countries and Germany as the global benchmarks, looking at what we have today. So I think just to finalize here on how we're seeing developments related to initiatives, programs, institutes, whatever, the frameworks to develop the skills of the future. There are 5 types of organizations that we're seeing emerging around the globe or gaining momentum. The first is really to address skills development at the earliest possible age, especially tech skills, but also soft skills. So we're seeing across the globe lots of schools that are training children in robotics, but also in leadership. So early age programs across the globe. We're seeing that from Cambodia to the UK, from Brazil to the US. The second type of thing that we're seeing is really focused on digital technologies and coding. There's a boom around the globe about coding schools and data analytics programs, institutes, schools, etc. The third thing, I think it's really related to new models for, not exactly new, but I would say an enhanced attention to higher education programs, especially problem-based learning and experiential learning in engineering, but across the board, right? Some of those really leveraging technology, using VR, extended reality, augmented reality to train health people. So I think that this whole thing about combining new tools and experiential learning and problem-based learning, it's the third type of movement that we're seeing around the globe. Fourth thing is we're seeing an increased number of programs that are joint programs involving industry and academia. And we see that in Australia, for instance, that has implemented an Industry 4.0 apprenticeship program that translates to the Australian reality a lot from the German dual model, right? And finally, I think that the fifth type of thing that we're seeing emerging or gaining momentum, it's leadership training. And I'll finalize with that. So those are the 5 types of models that we're seeing gaining momentum across the globe. And what are some of the trends, right? I think that's one trend is really about earliness, trying to address the development of skills as early as possible. right? And mentioned that. For sure, everything digital, it's gaining momentum. I think that we're seeing lots of things related to public-private partnerships. It's a complex issue. We need different stakeholders to come together in relation to that. But there are also some, let's say, some lessons that we should pay attention. I think that one of them, it's really that just training is not enough. We need to embed context, and we need to bring people who are building the future of work, who are building new industries, who are building new business functions to mentor people. But we also need connectors to do that, like people who are providing career advice for students, but at the same time, people who are coming from industry that could do that. Another lesson is, I think it's related to scalability. It's very hard to scale some of the things that are being done. One of the global leading coding schools that has been around for almost 10 years now has only graduated 7,000 students. How can we take that to 70 to 700,000? So scaling up those things is very hard. At the same time, it's hard to scale up the development of soft skills. I think there's something else that we should pay attention. It's very different. There's a big difference from inspiration, inspiring people, showing what's next. That's super cool. And really developing people in order for them to have the soft skills that we are all seeing: creativity, engagement, leadership, that are needed for this future of work, right? I commented about Australia and the developments there. So they expect to get probably between 5 to 10 years to 10,000 students being trained. Is that enough? So just to finish, right, I think some of the issues that we see today, right? I started as saying that the future already is here, but it's not evenly distributed, right? If we have a look this for the lenses of North America, I think that most of the skills that are commodity today in the workforce in the United States, for instance, they're in short supply in other parts of the globe. So, and especially, I would say, soft skills. So one question going forward is, how can we at the same time address the needs of the skills that are related to future industries, to the future of work, and the supply of the skills that already are in place in advanced nations to emerging nations? I think that's a critical issue that we're seeing as we have this global footprint in the GFCC. And the other thing, or the other emerging issue, is how do we build culture? How do we do team building? And from there, how do we build culture in a more digital environment, right? I think that a few months ago, there was a research showing that if we have a look at Sweden today, 45% of the whole work there can be done online right now. But how are we going to build teams? How are we going to create support? How are we going to build culture for this more digitally intensive future that already is here, but not everywhere? I'll stop here.
Wow, that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Roberto, for doing kind of that leading and context setting for us. And now to kind of pull it down a bit, we're going to be engaging the panelists, and a close colleague of mine, friend, and the Assistant Dean of Innovation and Research Affairs at UCSD Extension, Josh Shapiro, is with us today. And in past conversations I've had with him, not only is this an area that he looks at, but he's done some very interesting research that is going to give us a lot to think about. And so, Josh, if you could just kind of share with us some of your kind of findings, which will then allow us to then lead into a conversation, that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks. It's actually kind of hard to follow up, Roberto. I think you did a really great job of kind of covering a lot of the major topics that hopefully we'll dive into deeper today. So thank you for that, Roberto. And thank you, Greg, for having me. I'm gonna start with just a couple pessimistic and negative numbers, and then hopefully by the end of this conversation, we'll be able to find the opportunity and more positive slant to some of this. So The University of Chicago just came out with a recent research report that said upwards of 42% of job losses that we have so far experienced from COVID are likely not to return. So I would just pause on that for a moment. That's a very sobering number. 42% of the jobs that we've lost are likely not to return. And if you look at what real unemployment is, that's arguably higher than the Great Depression at this moment in time. So beyond the BLS has put out 14%, it's much closer to 25%, if not beyond that. And so just starting from the moment in time of where we are, I think the future of work and a lot of the things that the panelists and others have been thinking about for some time, we've really shown a light on it. And it was, you know, we knew things were happening, and there was this idea that, oh, it's happening slowly. If you look at machine learning and artificial intelligence, it's going to replace jobs over time, but new jobs are going to emerge to replace those. And what we've had here is this kind of radical disruption where all of a sudden, nearly overnight, you have this immense job loss. And as Roberto said, it's affecting different populations and demographics across the world very differently. So some of the research that we've started to do is looking at particular industries and particular job classifications to get a better understanding of, one, what jobs are likely to remain, what jobs are you likely to be able to do virtually, and then also looking at the types of skill sets that's needed. And again, going back to Roberto's point, this is both technical and soft skills. So what does that look like moving forward into the future of work? One of the other things that my research center at UCSD Extension is heavily involved in is the lifelong learning. And so the old kind of educational model was you get a degree and that is your commodity into the world of work for the foreseeable future, if not your entire life. And what we're seeing, and we've known this trend has been occurring for some time, is the importance of lifelong learning, the importance of reskilling and reskilling and reskilling again. And what I think is extremely interesting, and this is where I get a little more hopeful, is that we have seen immense changes in this arena. So everything from boot camps and intensives to the stackability of non-credit into credit courses. There's a lot of different ways that people are obtaining knowledge, both within the university and outside of the university. And I think this is a really interesting time to be thinking about different ways that knowledge and education is diffused within an economy to obtain that regional competitiveness. So those are a couple of the issues that I'm happy to dive into deeper, but hopefully that kind of begins to do some of the table setting of where this conversation may lead.
Wow, really, really nice. And where this kind of dovetails is, of course, Liz, who is with us from UCSD's School of Global Policy and Strategy, has been studying this very topic, but really as it affects workers. And what's fascinating is that as we move into some of these new realities, so much of innovation, or what we know as innovation, requires a lot of team effort. And so how does this not just affect the individual, but these collectives of individuals who have to come together and often, discuss, debate, disagree, and have a bit of this friction, but then allow that creative energy to translate itself into some outcomes. So Liz, if you could talk a little bit about kind of your research, but as we move to this remote work, what are some of the new skills that we have to do? And also this reality that we're so used to kind of looking in someone's eyes and being able to develop a lot of these tacit interactions. How does that then change given these new realities?
Yeah, thank you, Greg, so much for having me, and to the panelists. Right, so a lot has already been said. I don't want to repeat too much. Maybe I'll just pick up on a few of the themes that I think link well to things I've been thinking about. So the first point, Greg, about innovation being something that really occurs in teams, and that's increasingly so. If you look at research is increasingly done by bigger and bigger teams. You need more and more types of knowledge to generate novel innovation now than you did before. Even 50 years ago, we don't really have this like single innovator model anymore. And you can even see that with, Nobel Prizes going to groups now instead of individuals. And that's really important about, in how we think about remote work. It's really important in how we think about office work, but as has already been discussed, remote work brings in kind of new challenges. How do we connect? How do we make time to get to know each other? How do we trust each other remotely? And all those things are important because you do need to be sufficiently comfortable to share risky ideas, to turn each other down, to express disagreement, and you need to feel safe in order to express those feelings. And there's, pretty good evidence that we feel less safe in online conversations than we do in in-person conversations. So I think that even, eliminating the change to digital communication, there's still a lot we need to do to train our students in how to work in teams. So like one thing that I spend time in my research thinking about, and that I try to do in my teaching as well, is encourage people to work with people they don't know, people with different backgrounds, because we all have preferences for things that we understand. And so it can be easier for us to work with someone who did the same training that we did because we speak the same language, for instance, or that has the same racial background as we do because we have shared cultural experiences potentially. But in fact, the best ideas come from diverse backgrounds coming together as one. And in order for those ideas to be realized, we have to be able to work with people with different backgrounds than us, different trainings than us. And I think that there's a huge opportunity for universities like UCSD to train our students to do that. And this includes, if I study electrical engineering, I don't do all my classes in engineering. I also have to go work with people in humanities, people in social sciences, and learn what benefits those skill sets bring to the table. And similarly, understand that differences of all types are really positive for innovation. And as long as we can work together to bring those ideas together to create output, our ideas and innovation are going to be better. So I think that the universities have a huge role to play in that, and I think that's not something we've traditionally been particularly good at. And that relates to the soft skills that we've been talking about. Employers, the reference letters I write are, not whether or not the student knows how to work a given computer program, because as Josh has already mentioned, that computer program is probably going to be irrelevant in 2 years. What employers want to know is, can this person work with other people? Is this person motivated to learn? Does this person understand that their skill sets are going to expire, and are they willing to relearn? And those are all soft skills. Anyone can learn a computer program if they really want to. And so those are the types of things the labor market's demanding. And now when we move online, that's going to be even more important because you may not have the luxury of going out for a beer to settle your differences. And so coming into remote workforces with that mindset, with I have to see the value in my coworkers, and I have to show them what my value is more explicitly, I think is going to be critical for remote work. So while we can no longer necessarily rely on this really important tacit knowledge, Roberto brought up this point about how do you establish work culture online. Culture tends to be something that is tacitly exchanged in the office. So we see how our coworkers are working and we imitate that. But when we're all working in different places, the opportunities for that type of knowledge to be exchanged are limited. And so we have to go from this environment where managers depend on tacit knowledge exchange to one in which these things are actually explicitly codified and trained on in a much more explicit way. And I think there's a huge responsibility for managers to step up, not let these things play themselves out, because culture will be established whether you invest in it or not. And if you don't invest in it, it's probably going to be a negative culture. And so really stepping up, making these things explicit. And then the other thing I think is really important that Roberto brought up is, yes, we have a ton of technology now, but that doesn't mean we have any idea how to use it. And this comes up in managerial work of online workers. For instance, now for work being done online, which tends to be the type of work that can be done from home, managers can collect a ton of data on what their workers are doing. And we're seeing this all the time. Oh, managers see everything you do is being recorded. But what are they going to do with that data? Are they going to fire everyone? What type of feedback are they going to provide? How are they going to analyze that data? And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that that data can actually reduce the performance of your workers, because again, they don't feel safe. They feel like they're being tracked. They don't feel trusted. So just having the technology does not mean that we have solutions. This is a human technology, interfacing, and it's complicated. And again, that's something that relates to soft skills. Managers are not going to know how to use technology if they don't understand human nature. So yeah, I'll leave it there. I feel like there are a million things we could talk about, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be there.
And we will get to it. In fact, we already have a question, and this one comes from Sao Paulo, Brazil. So Roberto's part of the world, although Roberto didn't mention it. Are you in Brazil right now, Roberto?
I am, and I'm locked here. So I think I told you I came on February the 21st. I was traveling on March the 2nd, but I remained here. I'll probably stay here for a long time.
Oh, there we go. And therefore, so this is from a participant who's coming from Sao Paulo. And he said, with so many unemployed people, and of course, following on the comments that Josh made, that a lot of these jobs are not coming back, even if these people are reskilled, can we expect an overall just global reduction in the amount of people? And will we also be able to see, will these jobs still be paid the same thing? How does that affect the actual prosperity of the people in those jobs? So I'll open that up to you. Whoever wants to jump in, if I'll let people raise their hands and just jump in. We can have a free for all on that one.
Yeah, so I guess since no one else is jumping in, I think that's one of the, that's where research doesn't have that much to say at this point. What we're talking about at that level is structural shifts and changes that will impact the future of work, society, the percentage of employed people, what the salaries look like. And I think, as Roberto was mentioning earlier, there's a lot of prototyping in terms of UBI, like, universal basic income. What could that look like if there aren't, this beautiful supply and demand where everyone who wants a job has the opportunity to be able to obtain one. And so I think at this point, it's a little bit early to say what exactly the future of the economy is going to look like. There are interesting experiments going on both in the US and throughout the world that give us some insight, but I think it's a really great question that participant brought up, but I don't think anyone's gonna have a very specific answer on that.
Can I wait on that, Greg?
Unless Roberto has a specific answer.
So my answer is, I think that we don't have the answer, okay? I think the big issue here is we need to make decisions as societies or as humanity. If we put people in the assets or the liability column in our social balance sheet, this is a big social issue. And so the solution for this thing will not come straight and strictly from, let's say, training and education. It's a broader social issue that requires political engagement and it's a policy issue. So we need to be aware of that. And so we have a lot of people who are outside the workforce. We have a lot of people who are really in the liability column of our societies today. So we have costs, but we're not creating the value, mobilizing their potential as we could. How are we going to do that? I think there's this big issue about society models.
Wonderful, thank you. I'd actually like to invite Taylor now to say something, because the reason we wanted Taylor on this call, besides her just being awesome, is because she represents the consumer and customer for everything we're talking about. She was a UCSD student, she's an alum now, and she's navigated this transition from university life to a career. But just as importantly too, she still has a large social network, many of whom are still currently facing some of these conversations. They're inside a university and they're asking a lot of these questions about what is this world going to look like? And she hopefully will be giving advice to them. So part of this conversation will be, you know, what questions or what insights do you specifically have, Taylor? What kind of questions, you know, should we be, you know, trying to answer in all of this, rather than just saying it's too early, we don't know? What advice do we give these people that we represent and that we have a responsibility and accountability to, so that we can do the best job?
Yeah, absolutely. So hi everyone, I'm Taylor. Thanks Greg for having me on, and thanks to all the panelists so far for your commentary. I've taken like 3 pages of notes, so if you see me looking down, that's why. But as Greg said, I think I am here to kind of offer that micro kind of level of analysis. So I work as a product engineer at Illumina. So for those of you who don't know what Illumina is, if you've ever heard of genetic sequencing, gene sequencing, or 23andMe or Ancestry.com, we create the platforms that enable people to do genetic sequencing. And I think everything you all said is really quite interesting. I had some conversations with other UCSD alum that I know, and I think everything you all have said has kind of addressed some of my concerns about the future and also the things I'm excited about. I think it's really interesting, especially thinking about like how work, the jobs that are desired will change moving forward. I think about, you know, I wrote down our interns this year. So for Illumina, we've always had an in-person internship program, and now we have 70 plus interns that are virtual. And my team, the product engineering team, we are data people. So I technically do like 100% data. It's not 100% my job. As you all mentioned, soft skills are also important. So I do soft skill things as well, but technically my job is entirely remote. And so we started with 1 intern, and all of a sudden we have 5 because other teams are like, they were supposed to, you know, this intern was supposed to be in wet lab helping us out in this manufacturing area, and they no longer can. So can they do something data related? And other teams don't have, you know, the computer skills or other things to kind of help out. So that's been really interesting, just to kind of witness that firsthand. But I did also really appreciate, Roberto, what you said about kind of inspiration in the beginning. You said, you know, it's great to inspire students to accomplish all these things, but how can we actually get them from university to industry? And I think I kind of see an analog here with this conversation. Like I'm really inspired right now, but how can we actually take the things that we're discussing here and have them translate to industry and help all the current students and even, you know, recent or not so recent alum.
Thank you. Thank you. And we actually, that generated a number of questions. It did. And 2 of them are slightly related, but I'll ask one of them first and then add on the second part. So we have one of our colleagues from Tijuana, and she's looking at the binational area of San Diego and Tijuana. She said, you know, San Diego and Tijuana have developed a way of working together, mainly through the maquiladora industries, although this also happens in other areas. Do you think that this new normal will push the binational communities to work together even more closely or to develop a new way of working together? So how does this affect kind of that cross-cultural and cross-border type of stuff?
I can say something on this.
Wonderful.
Again, very speculatively. I did a little bit of work with Thermo Fisher, who set up a R&D lab in Tijuana, and they're working with other biotech companies to try to build out the tech sector in Baja California, so we can also capitalize on those types of exchanges, move beyond manufacturing. Because, you know, there are great universities in Baja and great skilled labor. But I think I'll speak more generally about what this means for cross-border, even cross-state working relationships. I mean, certainly the move to remote work does make a very spread out workforce more feasible for companies. So there have already, you know, I think Joshua mentioned yeah, I think that even before COVID, you know, these changes were happening. It's just all of a sudden now they're happening really suddenly. So we were already getting these, like, you know, opportunities for international labor forces, even within the same team, with cross-border teams and things like that. But now if no one's in the office, you almost think like, well, why don't we just hire? We have the, you know, the world is our oyster, and we hire that way. And there are certainly huge benefits for that in terms of flexibility. But again, there's potential barriers to collaboration. And so I think if this opportunity is properly managed, and we certainly do know how these issues can be managed, to some extent, maybe we don't know the optimal, but we do know how they can be done better, then I do think there are opportunities for cross-border teams and collaboration to increase.
Thanks. So a question that kind of follows on that is, what impact does immigration have in creating a robust workforce?
Yeah, I'll speak and then I will stop. I saw that question. It's such an important question.
Oh, okay.
With everything that's going on right now. And, you know, we just have so much data that immigrants play a huge role in our innovation ecosystem. They, again, approach problems from different ways than we do. They're a super motivated group of people. It's hard to immigrate. And so the people that do tend to be selected from, you know, a subset of population that are very resilient. They've been trained in different systems. And again, they're very motivated. And we just know immigrants contribute disproportionately to innovation around the world, not just in the US, but particularly in the US. And so, you know, yeah, immigration is just intensely important to innovation success.
Does anyone else have anything to add to that? Or you don't have to. I didn't want to step on anybody.
I'll give you a very short, different perspective on that. The global average for immigration is 3.5%. This means that in average, countries have 3.5% of their populations comprised by immigrants. That number in the United States is 15%. So 15% of everybody who lives in the US was born abroad. That is essential to drive innovation because of the soft skills. You learn how to engage with different stakeholders, because of the ideas that are cross-pollinized for that, because of the connections that it creates. Let me give you the counter example. You mentioned, I do come from Brazil. I'm in Brazil today. So a lot of people in Brazil, including my friends here in this conversation, have last names that come from across the globe. Brazil has the largest contingent of Japanese immigrants in the globe. It had more immigrants from Italy than the United States. But today, in average, the Brazilian population only has 0.3% of immigrants. That's very limited. And that also is part of the explanation for the lack of innovation. I think that you were not in Argentina with us back in 2018, Greg, but I flew from Argentina to the southern part of Brazil, and we had the deans of the 3 major engineering schools there in a conference, and I was talking about the future of cities, whatever, right? And we had 400 people in the auditorium, and I asked them this question: how many people from India do you know here in your town? Do you know how many have raised their hands? Zero. That's completely unbelievable for the US lenses, right? So a big economy, detached from the world, detached from the flow of people and ideas and connections, can hardly innovate and scale up solutions globally. Immigrants through different angles are essential.
Amazing, amazing. Because your colleague from Sao Paulo also asked a question. He says, this question, because you mentioned in your opening comments a few times this concept of leadership, how we need to focus as much on these soft skills, including leadership, as much as the technical skills. And he says, I believe self-leadership is one of the most required soft skills for today. Because if one cannot lead yourself, particularly as we move between these kind of more isolated forms of work to these kind of group, even virtual types of work, if we can't do that properly, then we probably won't be able to lead the organizations well. How do you kind of feel about that? And if Liz, you want to jump in on that as well, since you kind of focus on some of those human skills as well.
You mean me? My
Yeah.
take on that?
Yeah.
So how do you train leaders? I think that leaders and entrepreneurs are mostly trained through the examples that they see in society, in family, and in life. Right?
Exactly.
I do believe that leadership can be trained, but I think it's hard. And once again, here come the asymmetry, right? If you have a look at Latin America, the emerging world, you don't find leadership development programs as you find in North America. So the infrastructures to do that, they're not in place here. And I personally believe that the biggest gap in terms of skills, if we compare like the emerging world and advanced nations, it's not really about hard skills. It's mostly about soft skills. I think as Elizabeth and Taylor were saying, lots of those things, they're embedded in society. They're embedded in how you do things in your daily life. They're embedded from the very early days in the educational system. You learn how to introduce an idea, how to manage a meeting. Those things are in short supply in the emerging world, and I'll give you data. So back in 2003, a group of researchers in Brazil got data from 75 manufacturing companies. That represents 97.5% of the manufacturing GDP in Brazil. Microdata on employment, exports, revenue, innovation. Brazil has a well-developed innovation survey, right? And the impacts of transnational companies, global companies operating in Brazil are very positive because of the flow of people. They train people who then move to other companies. And through that, they disseminate, like, let's say, I would say, better ways of working. If we think about the productivity gap in the world, it can be a bit of that can be explained by machines and equipment. But a lot of that, it explained about work processes, work routines, and things that we don't see and that maybe we take for granted in different realities, but that are in short supply to a great extent in most of the world today. And I think leadership is part of that. So how can we, and that's an enormous strength for an economy like the US, but also a very weak point for the emerging world in general, especially if we have a look at Latin America.
Liz.
I will add to that. That's right. So Greg, your colleague at Stanford, Nick Bloom, has these great surveys that show that management is much worse in lower income countries, low and middle income countries. And among the companies, manufacturing companies in those countries with good management, performance and productivity is similar to like American firms. And so, yes, this productivity gap is certainly contributed to by management skills. And, you know, other research, Nick's included and some of mine, show that it's not like an innate ability to lead, that people in Western countries are just, you know, innately better leaders. That's not the case. We have access to training. And when you train leaders in those countries in how to better manage, they do it. They better manage and they're better leaders. So it's just investing in these skills. It's so critical. It absolutely can be taught. There's enough, you know, good experimental research that shows these things can be taught. And that's just a question of individuals and policymakers and schools investing in those skill sets and improving productivity as a result.
I just wanted to mention one thing in relationship to this. So everyone knows that essential skills are critical. Industry asks for these in terms of their job applications and as well as during the interview. But one thing that I don't think that we've developed the same level of sophistication in is being able to measure some of these soft skills. So the typical interview does a pretty poor job in that 1 hour or less of really teasing out someone's ability to communicate, or do they have that leadership qualities. And so I think as industry demands the essential skills, there also needs to be a recognition that we don't have the same level of sophistication of being able to understand where someone's weaknesses or strengths lie, in the same way that we know, can this person code? Do they know Java? Do they know Tableau? That stuff's pretty well teased out and very easy to teach, or the computer can teach itself how to do the coding pieces. But I think there really is a gap, and hopefully in this new environment, there's going to be more research to help better equip people to be able to understand these essential skills.
Agreed, because we often think of leadership only in the kind of framework of management, but we're finding that so many, particularly when we say these high impact, high growth companies, that this kind of vision-led type of leadership, these people to really articulate and storytell around a very exciting future and get people following them into that, as opposed to pushing them from behind, is also really important. And how you actually kind of teach those softer skills, because it encompasses new types of skills that 20 years ago when we trained our management forces didn't exist, like the concepts of networking and communication, reading social feedback. And it even becomes even more difficult when we're on things like this, because the whole concept of reading social cues can be muted by these kinds of things, but it's such a big part of the human experience. Taylor, how have you found that to be as you've kind of migrated from this kind of, from the workplace where you're going to work every day, and now you're kind of working in this kind of remote setting? Have you found kind of those social connections changing in some way? And the work, are you seeing the productivity equivalent or changing in some dynamic way?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the answer to that would change widely depending on who you asked at Illumina and even who you asked on my team. I think my immediate team, I thought it was very interesting that, Liz, you talked about management. I have a fantastic manager, and I have my manager's manager is also fantastic. And so I think, we have a stand up every morning where we just chat. And I actually talked to my manager a while back and was like, I feel like this is a waste of my time, like we're not doing anything technical. And she was like, no, it's really important that we like hang out as a team every morning and we have these connections. So I think with my immediate team, which is composed of 6 people, I don't see that. And therefore I don't see a productivity decrease. We actually just completed a really large project entirely remotely, and it's enjoyable working with them. And so I think that's like one very critical aspect. However, I don't see that organization-wide, and I think it is largely attributable to management. But at the same time, I think I liked the self-leadership aspect because I think in industry, especially that going from that transition to industry, and maybe it's because I just have not a master's, a bachelor's, not an advanced graduate degree. So I'm truly bottom of the totem pole in my current role. I mean, I've been promoted. I've worked there for about 1.5 years and I've been promoted, but ultimately there's many, many people above me and not many people below me. So it's kind of hard to feel like you can be a self-leader, like you can showcase leadership skills and help drive the vision or the company culture or productivity. But I think kind of to what everyone's been saying, like I did have really good leaders in my life growing up. And so I do think I embody a lot of those qualities myself. And I consider that a tremendous privilege. So I think I'm able to do that, but there's a clear distinction between people who can't. And I think, especially like having only a bachelor's, everyone on my team has an advanced degree except for me. And so again, it's just kind of a little bit ironic that I am able to kind of have that confidence and that leadership without having, you know, the technical knowledge. And perhaps that's just because I had good role models and the training and privilege of, you know, being where I am and when I am, to Roberto's point.
Yeah. So what? Who's Liz was going to jump in. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Liz.
I want to comment on Taylor's point about just having these examples around her growing up, and I think Roberto brought it up too in the context of Brazil. There's this concept of dinner table human capital, and recent evidence has shown just how important this is for kids who grow up in settings where, you know, they are able to, you know, learn from their parents these soft skills, and that way you're learning it your entire life. And so, like, if for boys, if their dad is an entrepreneur, they're way more likely to go into entrepreneurship. And that's not true for girls. It doesn't seem like that information is being communicated to girls as well at the dinner table. But what this means for policymakers and for schools like the UC is targeting soft skills to people who may not have had the opportunity to develop those skills at home is super duper important. And I have a study that shows that this training, you know, given to people who have had this through their parents is essentially wasted. But when you invest it in people who didn't have that, who grew up in homes where their parents didn't have the opportunity to do that for them, actually like increases their likelihood of going on into leadership and entrepreneurship roles to the level of those people who did have it growing up. So, you know, yes, you can get it growing up, but if you don't, it's not like the end of the story for you. It just means that educators and policymakers have the opportunity to fill that gap.
That's fantastic. Had a question from one of our participants that says, one of the outcomes of this pandemic and the moving to work from home is that globalization of the digital workforce is accelerating. So if computer-based work can be done efficiently from outside the office setting, then it will most certainly migrate to lower cost, higher value locations and possibly workforces, just as we've already seen in the analog manufacturing labor. How will this digital globalization likely impact the value of skilled labor in the near and long term?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. If you think 3 months ago, 4 months ago, everyone moved to where they live for work. So I'm going to take a job on the East Coast. I'm going to move there. There's some recent research out that's showing people are starting to emotionally reevaluate where they live, why they live there, do they need to live there? And so this kind of reimagination or reimagining what work is, where it is, how it should be done. Should it be done within, you know, a 9 to 5 within the geographic setting that my headquarters or office is located is definitely disrupting the way people are thinking about it. That's tangential to your question. I think more specific to your question, as managers and others become more comfortable with the idea of remote working, I do see a massive trend and disruption again occurring where cheaper skilled labor for virtual online work is going to occur. And I think some of that was, you know, it's actually less about economics, and it's more about socio-cultural comfort with the ability to say, oh, people aren't just playing at home, or someone's not gonna be in the office, but they're still able to be productive and advance this project. And then to a lot of Elizabeth's earlier points, once you're able to create those connections, to have that same semblance of here's a team, or like Taylor was saying, we're developing a team virtually, I do think that barrier is definitely going to be lowered of where people are sourcing talent.
Liz, did you want to make a comment? I couldn't see if you were looking to make a comment there.
I mean, yeah, I think that's right. And the more, if I was a worker now thinking of like, how am I gonna, upgrade my skills? What am I gonna do? I really think investing in being able to work with people around the world, people with different cultures, is going to be critical, because I do think that teams are going to increasingly be sourced from around the world. And to be a productive member of that team, you have to know how to work with people who don't look like you, essentially.
Wonderful. The other thing that I could talk to, even back in the 90s, because, of course, dating myself, is my first Silicon Valley startup that I did. We were able to actually increase productivity we had a number of software programmers and developers working 12 hours opposite our cycles. They were in Russia, and the ability to basically have 24-hour productivity where they would work on something, push it back to us when we got up in the morning, we had something in our inboxes to react to, actually increased our productivity and therefore our value. So perhaps there are even some new models.
Can I just comment on that real quick,
Yeah.
Rick? It just brought up something that I was reading recently about the 24-hour work cycle, and this idea of like productivity, GDP being the end-all be-all of what society is supposed to be striving towards. Mm-hmm. And again, I think this actually gets back to the original question of, with mass unemployment, what does the future and structure of the economy look like? What are the values, the morals, the ethos that are important and driving? And I think, at least the first time in my life, I feel like some of that isn't just taken for granted in the same way, and not necessarily that there will end up being massive disruption and change. But I do see that conversation occurring. And from a sociological perspective, I find that to be very interesting. We don't know exactly where it will go at this point, but that conversation about this kind of capitalist drive of GDP and what that means for society and our human relations, I'm just fascinated that it is seeming to be quite a bit more important currently.
Roberto. I didn't know if you were going to.
I was just nodding here, said I fully agree, right?
Got it.
But there's a different angle that I would like to bring to the conversation here. And I think that Josh highlighted that before, that speed. I am an engineer by training, and I'm pretty sure that down the road at a certain point, I'll be able to download skills to my brain. We haven't gotten there yet, yeah. But at the same time, so we see things accelerating. So there's a decoupling here. The speed of things happening around the globe and accelerating, and the need to reskill, to shift things, and our capacity to address that through the training and education and whatever systems we have. So I think that one thing, that the speed thing that Josh commented before, it's chief. How are we addressing that? So this is one angle of the conversation. The other thing that is, we are wasting lots of things. I think that Elizabeth mentioned that organizations have an incredible amount of data about ourselves. They're poorly using that to improve performance. So just reading my emails, I'm pretty sure that my employer would understand when I perform better, when I have more speed, when I go low, the types of topics in which I really engage. So there's a huge opportunity here for organizations. We are wasting data from an organizational management perspective today that we could use to boost performance, right? And just if I may, I really wanted to make a question, or to turn to Taylor. So you recently entered, like, I mean, not a decade ago, right? So how did you see this transition in terms of the things that you were getting ready to do? And when you transition, it's like a phase change in a physical system, right? You have different speed, it's an inflection. What would you do different today in your education, in your training, if you had known the real environment and the things that we're seeing coming up?
That's a really good question. I think it's hard to say because I think I've always been a future-minded person, and so I think I kind of anticipated what would happen. And so I studied bioengineering at UCSD, but I really focused on a lot of data. So I found a PI who was really into data, Todd Coleman. He was fantastic, and knew that would help me because Todd said it would help me. But there were quite a few professors again that I had that were really good at saying, this you should learn Python. Python will help you in the workplace. Again, that can be attributed to like one lucky conversation with Todd. I think that's kind of the interesting thing about that transition is, and I don't know how I could necessarily change this, but just one observation that I have about it is you kind of the evolution of your education, you build up all of this incredible knowledge and you're learning cooler and cooler things. By the end, we're doing our bioengineering senior design projects. People are literally creating mind-controlled prosthetics and, honing in on the genes for life. Those were literal, senior design projects that happened at UCSD, which are awesome. But then all of a sudden, I'm shot into industry, and I'm ready to go. I'm ready to contribute these cutting-edge ideas. I'm ready to teach people about how Todd Coleman worked in a lab where they were flying mind-controlled planes over, cornfields in Illinois, and I kind of just get told like, no, if that's not broken, don't fix it. Like it works, keep it as is. Kind of counter to what Liz said earlier about how every 2 years they're going to ask you for new skills. I think my experience in industry has shown that industry is filled with like well-seasoned people who kind of have a way that works, and why change it? So maybe going back to the soft skills, negotiation skills would have been very, very helpful to have. I think, I've read books and watched TED Talks that have helped me, but that's something that we didn't expect. That kind of blindsided, I think, everyone, and that echoed with the folks I talked to before this too.
Love that.
Can I add to that, Greg, quickly?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like middle management, immovability, that characterizes so many large companies in particular. Yeah, I think, so I teach management at GPS, and we often do cases, and the students are like, how could that have gone wrong? Like, that's so easy. They could have seen that technology worked way better than that, for instance, but they didn't adopt, like, how could that happen? But these are humans, who have their own personal incentives that often work against the goal of the organization, or, yeah. And again, this is like, a lot of people don't want to update their skills. And if they're in a position of management, they can make sure they never have to update their skills. And that can flunk an organization. And if you're not paying attention to what's going on in middle management, you have big problems. So that problem is that's a widespread issue that I think is under focused on. And I do think that we have a role in our business school and the policy school, but even among our undergrads, to say like, look, this is going to happen, and this is like what you can do to get around it. I think that's like such a great point, because I think it's such a point of failure for so many organizations.
Wonderful. Roberto.
Elizabeth, I do want to upgrade my skills, but I'm very frustrated with the time it takes. So speed is a critical issue. So Taylor, when you have that BCI, the computer brain interface ready, please let me know. I need that.
Greg, can I just make a little plug for extension?
Absolutely.
And professional and continuing education in general. I do think time is the single barrier for individuals like Roberto, who want to upskill and say, I can't fit that into my already busy, very filled life. And I do think education, while it can be slow to change, has been pretty good about adapting to assuring that they're able to deliver what the customer needs. And so certificates, which once took 2 years, can be done now online in a boot camp format in 3 months, if that's what someone needs. It can be just in the evenings online. And so I have seen a lot of kind of ed tech innovation to assure that skills, even like very micro level skills can be taught, you know, within 5, 10, 20 minutes, if that's all the time you have, and then stacked together to ensure that someone's still getting a quality education.
Absolutely. And that follows very much on the trends that we love, this trend of democratization, where you take what has historically been asymmetric, either advantage or, you know, which includes time, and you kind of spread it out that we can do this just-in-time learning. We can collect badges and certificates, refresh things, and so we can fill the nooks and crannies of our time. So I absolutely love it. What I'd love to use with the remaining time is really kind of get down to some of the solutions and how we kind of take these conversations and actually drive it to something meaningful. In fact, one of the conversations was that why we love to address on this, because we want to know this, is what should UCSD be doing now so that we're still relevant, 25 years from now? And Taylor, you can weigh in at what are you telling either your younger self or your colleagues who are still at UCSD? And if you had a chance to bring UCSD leadership, which you have some of that here in this Zoom room right now, what would you be telling us that we perhaps should be looking at?
Yeah, I'll try to kind of keep it at as brief as possible. So this isn't all of my thoughts. This is one of my thoughts, maybe two. But I think one thing that would be really, really beneficial, and I think Roberto touched on it earlier, is like cross-department kind of teamwork within UCSD. I think that's something that, again, I saw it outside of my education. So I was a member of the UCSD dance team where I had interactions and had to learn how to work with people who didn't look like me, didn't major in the same thing as me, so didn't come from similar backgrounds. The only thing that we had in common is that we danced. And that was really valuable. And that's like an experience that some people get, but not all. And I see how it helped me in the workforce, but even more so would have been, having to have a project with like a political science major or something that would really kind of ground the engineering that I'm doing or that I learned in college into something that's tangible. The other thing, and I think this has kind of been expressed as well, but continue teaching students how to learn. I think that's also very, very important. Kind of contrary to my experience, again, like I think engineers do get that. We are definitely taught to learn, but my sister, who was an international studies political science major, I think that's what it was, she had an experience writing an honors thesis where she learned how to learn, but maybe a lot of social science students at UCSD don't get that, and I think that's absolutely critical moving forward, as you all have touched on.
I'd like to, was someone else going to say something? For Josh and Liz, and if Roberto wants to jump in as this as well, have there been existing programs, rather than thinking that everything we have to do has to be novel and new? Are there things that have basically come before that we might be able to repurpose or adapt? Things like, the 1930s Green New Deal, the 1960s space race, these grand challenges and prizes that can help us think through some of these issues. Is it possible for us to basically look at something that perhaps worked well before that can be adapted or adapted to kind of this new reality?
I don't have an answer to that, but I'll just answer what I wish you had asked me. So 10 years or so ago, there was an article called The Death of the Degree. And this was the university system as it's constituted is no longer relevant to society. So obviously a little bit of hyperbole. The idea was, as we move to a skills-based economy, a 4-year degree isn't going to have the same power or value in the marketplace that it did. And what I find so interesting is both the university adapts and changes over time, but it's also what other people, the other panelists have mentioned. The university is providing so much more than one specific skill or 3 specific skills. It is about the communication. Hopefully there can be more interdisciplinary work, as Taylor's mentioning, but all those types of connections, the socialization, the communication. And so I think the position of the university is quite interesting at this time, where it is on the one hand supposed to be teaching job relevant skills, both through extension and through main campus, but also all of the other components that are embedded and wrapped into that of what a degree signifies, what it means. And so I think that's, you know, that as we look to the future of the university, of what industry needs, I think being able to signify what that relationship, what that connection is, and really assuring that like what the university is providing remains important to industry and vice versa. To your earlier question, I'm gonna tap Roberto to answer that.
So a few thoughts here. I think this is a very broad and actually I didn't understand if the questions related to the broader society, social settings, whatever, or education, but let me try to address. Three initial comments. Bold matters. We did research, I think it's widely documented, but we reviewed 17 big transformational tech projects in the GFCC, and we published a report leveraging extreme innovation. The impacts are huge in terms of creating new technologies, envisioning and creating a future from whatever, from DNA sequencing to whatever, autonomous cars. So bold matters. We know that, right? Second thing, education matters. So governments, nations, regions that have heavily invested in putting in place functional, widely available education systems that provide opportunities for everybody have moved forward. We know that. So this is well established, right? Third thing, national efforts matter. So, and this gets, it's a more complex, but because it gets connected to the political and the policy environment, whatever, but building consensus to drive change, mobilize national attention and resources, those things matter. Having said that, down to the more skills, work, education systems, I think there are two important things here that can be actually done. The first thing, we can repurpose methods and frameworks that are already successful. Let me give you one example, and Josh mentioned that. We have boot camps for whatever now, from coding. Boot camps, having a boot camp is not a new idea, right? So we can repurpose that and address like some critical training and skills things. The other thing, it's arbitrage. We know models that work in a certain reality. If we take those models and that knowledge to a different reality, space, market, environment, we can create value that's not being created today, right? So for instance, I think that I mentioned Industry 4.0, the whole dual education apprenticeship system, especially in the STEAM domain that you have in northern countries in Germany. I think that's being tried across nations. The example in Australia is one of those. So I think if we have we need to understand some of the models that are out there and maybe repurpose things, but also we can deploy things across geographies and create value that's not being created today.
Can I just comment on that really quick? One of the new products that came out of MZ, the Economic Modeling Specialists International Group, is called Skills Match. And so this is a little bit of tech in touch. It's taken an old concept of saying you have a particular domain of skills, whether it's technical, soft, etc., and it can pull this from you, your employer, your CV or resume, and then it helps you map a pathway that shows how those skills are relevant to different domains. So by adding on a boot camp with these 3 skills, it opens up these 6 occupations, or going down a different path towards a degree, it would open up these occupations. And this would be the ROI on different pathways for you to take. And so again, it's an old concept integrating some new technology that I think actually has the ability to enable people to better understand what are my options, so I don't get stuck in a singular path and say, this is what I'm supposed to do, this is what my parents told me to do, this is what people who did before me. But you know, you are able to sit back and say, based off of my skill set, I can go in a number of different directions. And one of the problems we had on the policy side was this, like, let's turn coal miners into coders. It's a beautiful sentiment in some sense, but it's also a little tone deaf, right? There's a particular skill set, a way of life, etc. That doesn't necessarily mean, oh, well, we have all these coding jobs and the coal miners are going out of business. It's brilliant. Let's put it together. And so I think there are opportunities such as MZ Skills Match that's going to help advance and help enable people to take their next step.
If I may add something, Greg,
Sure.
here. I think I mentioned that Singapore Skills that is providing the tools for citizens. For sure, Singapore has 5.5 million inhabitants. It's not a big country, right? We know that. So the scalability issue needs to be considered. But it's providing online tools for citizens to do exactly what Josh just mentioned, to make your own assessment and help you to reflect and think about your path going forward, right? So that may not be applicable in places in sub-Saharan Africa, but there are lots of realities where you could use those tools and make those tools available to citizens.
Wonderful. We're coming to the end of our time together, but one thing I would like to ask the audience members who are listening is usually we end our conversations with some sort of a call to action. And what we'd love to hear your thoughts. There's a number of questions we didn't get to. Some of them were particularly related to the idea that this younger generation that's moving into the workforce certainly has a strong social consciousness that they want to see, to kind of embed that in these skills that they're doing, social and environmental issues. And will that create new kinds of opportunities? And the answer is absolutely it's going to. In fact, we see one new class of workers that historically have been underserved and haven't, are emotional laborers. These people who will support it. And that's only going to increase, particularly when we have some of this kind of more distance type of work we do and remote work. With regards to some of the kind of harder skilled jobs, one of our attendees asked the questions about how are we going to be using things like robotics, AR, VR, AI, and will that enhance the workforce and while reinforcing these desperate needs for soft skills? Absolutely. In fact, next week I'll be doing my very first board of directors. I sit on a number of boards of directors. We're doing our first board of directors meeting completely in VR for what we're doing. So yes, these tools are going to become more important as we understand, as we experiment. We're actually doing a summer incubator at UCSD, the Converge Incubator. And the students are going to be doing this for the first time completely virtually. And we're experimenting with new tools that allow for these tacit collaborations that Elizabeth was talking about, that give us not only the experiential types of learning, but also the skills necessary. So I want to end this conversation by thanking each and every one of the panelists for giving their time and their perspective and wisdom. I thought it was fantastic. And even more, I want to thank the participants for being on and asking what I think are some of the best questions that I've seen in these kinds of conversations. If we didn't get to you, please email us separately, and we look forward to seeing you on the next conversations, and let's keep the dialogue going. So thank you very much, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Greg. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.